So yeah, let me walk you through this paper. This one is a neuroscience theory paper, so very different from the other paper in terms of results and stuff. So the paper is called Hierarchy or Heterarchy, a theory of long-range connections for the sensorimotor brain. And to give a brief introduction, well, first of all, the first part of the presentation, also the first part of the paper, is about neuroscience evidence, and kind of a review and summary of long-range connections in the neocortex. And the second part of this presentation will be about what the function of these long-range connections might be and what functional requirements they would fulfill when you think of the brain as solving sensorimotor tasks. Okay, and so to frame all of this neuroscience evidence, I think it's useful to just recap kind of the basic structural organization in the neocortex. I think you're all aware of this, but just as a brief recap. So we have the neocortex, which is basically a thin sheet that's kind of wrinkled up a bit in our heads. And if you cut through this sheet at any point, here, 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 you observe this kind of layered organization, and the different layers contain different types of neurons, different densities of neurons, and can have different response properties. And this picture was first kind of drawn out by Cajal in 1911, and then further classified and analyzed and so on. And basically, we find this 6-layered structure essentially anywhere you cut. Depending on where you cut, the layers might have different sizes. But overall, anywhere people classify it into 6 layers. Sometimes layers are classified into sublayers, like layer 4 is often split up in the visual cortex, and there's layer 5A and layer 5B and so on. But they are these 6 basic overall layers. And then orthogonal to that, so if you look alongside these layers, like in this direction, you can find these functional units called cortical columns. And these are not really something you can observe under a microscope, but they're more defined by their response properties, in that all the columns within a cortical column respond to the same receptive field, and the column next to it has a different receptive field. It might be overlapping with the one next to it, but it's a different receptive field. And if you move about like 200 to 600 micrometers along the surface of the cortex, you don't have overlapping receptive fields anymore. You're in a totally different column. And then as a little detail too, you can then decompose a column further into about 50 to 100 microcolumns, which are defined by their response to similar features, so similar oriented edge, for example. And maybe the most extreme example of this is the barrel cortex, where basically each whisker of a rat corresponds to one column. And then if you look at different sensory organs like the skin or your retina, the patches can be a bit more overlapping and less clearly defined. And the first one to identify the structure and also propose that the columns could be the basic unit of computation in the neocortex, or the microcolumns in this case, is Vernon Mountcastle, and that's the columnar hypothesis that thousand brains theory is strongly based on. So what do we mean when we talk about long-range connections? So when we talk about long-range connections here, we're talking about axons that travel outside of a cortical column from which they originate. So every neuron connects to neurons within the column it kind of originates or has its cell body in, but then some of them kind of send their axon outside of the bounds of the cortical column. And that can happen either by the neuron entering the white matter through layer 6 and then re-entering the cortex elsewhere. That's because information travels faster in the white matter. So if you look at this picture here, the gray matter is this kind of structure up here with the layers, and then the white matter is here. So information would go from the neuron down into the white matter, travel very fast along the axon, and then re-enter somewhere else in the column. So it's kind of schematically shown as an example here. We have a pyramidal neuron in layer 2-3, and then it sends an axon down, all the way down. And then we have a cortico-cortical connection. It's just indicated here, which means a connection from one area of the cortex to another area of the cortex. So this axon would then travel to some other column, go back up and connect somewhere. And then alternatively, it can travel within the cortex without going into the white matter for a distance of more than 1 millimeter. So here's an example of that shown kind of schematically, where we have the red part shows an axonal branching of a layer 2-3 pyramidal cell that can kind of travel across columns. And yeah, just to note, I'm going to show some figures from other neuroscience papers in this presentation, just to kind of illustrate the concepts. Pretty much everything I'm showing in the first part of the presentation is based on a culmination of results from hundreds of neuroscience papers and people at Numenta, particularly Jeff, studying them for about 20 years now. So it's not like this is the only example of this or only publication, but I just tried to find some illustrative examples to kind of visualize the points I'm making here. Okay, so we grouped the long-range connections in 4 conceptual categories for the purpose of this paper. First, we have the hierarchical cortico-cortical connections. Those are the very classical connections that define the cortical hierarchy, as people usually think about it, of like information entering the brain, getting processed, sending further high up in the hierarchy, getting further processed, getting sent to the next level of the hierarchy, further processing happening, all within the neocortex. Then we have non-hierarchical cortico-cortical connections, where we have connections between different columns within the neocortex, but as I will argue in a moment, they can't really be interpreted as hierarchical processing. Then we have cortico-thalamic connections, which basically every part of the neocortex connects to the thalamus in a very structured way. And then we have layer 5 motor outputs. And both of these 2 categories can kind of be interpreted as hierarchical, but also non-hierarchical, and I'll explain why in a moment. There are more long-range connections in the neocortex, like to the striatum or the claustrum, but we are omitting those from this review here. And yeah, also just kind of trying to summarize high-level principles. So if you go into the literature, it's never as clear-cut and clear-defined as we show it here. For every rule, there's an exception. Some principles vary by species. Some principles vary by sensory modality. There are always some little details, always some conflicting findings, but this kind of tries to condense it to high-level principles. A lot of them are kind of accepted textbook knowledge. Some of them are less commonly thought of when you think about long-range connections than others. So yeah, let's start with the most commonly type of thought of long-range connection in the neocortex, which are the hierarchical connections. And the general idea is that information comes from the sensor, it enters the thalamus. From the thalamus, it goes to a relay cell in the thalamus, which relays the information to the neocortex, and there enters in layer 4, which is seen as the classical input layer of the column, but also there's some information entering at the border of layer 5 and layer 6. Some information processing happens within the column, and it gets neurons in layer 3 are activated, and then layer 3 is often seen as kind of the classical output layer of the column, and we have this connectivity between layer 3 of a lower region to layer 4 of a higher region as the input to that region. By the way, Niels, feel free to interrupt me if I forget about anything or add to it. Yeah. And that way it goes up the hierarchy again in the next region, information processing happening within the column. Neurons in layer 3 activate. There are long-range connections from layer 3 to layer 4 in the next higher up region. And then we have the feedback connections, which are shown in purple here, which originate in the deeper layers, so layer 6, and then they go into the lower region where they can kind of form local connections or have some aberrations down in layer 6 or sometimes also layer 5. And then the axon ascends all the way up to layer 1 and spreads pretty broadly. So it can even spread outside of the cortical column to multiple columns in the lower region. When I say region here, this could be, for example, V1 and V2 in the visual cortex. So the figure shows kind of an illustration of one cortical column in a lower region like V1 and one cortical column in a higher region like V2. And then there are several layers that kind of send their branches up to layer 1, where they could be integrating this feedback information. And this is basically how the classical hierarchy is defined in the Bellman von Essen paper. Essentially, the connections between two hierarchically arranged regions are asymmetrical. So region 2 doesn't really have layer 3 to layer 4 connections down to region 1, and region 1 doesn't really have these layer 6 up to layer 1 connections to region 2. They're asymmetric. And that's how Bellman von Essen back in 1991 kind of made this famous picture of the hierarchy in, I think, the macaque monkey brain. And then just to show another more experimental image of this idea. So here we have retrograde labeled neurons in V2 that are shown here. So these are neurons in V2, and then they inserted a dye in V1 and in V4. And you can see that the dye inserted in V4, which is a higher up, a region that's located higher in the hierarchy than V2, you can see that these get inputs from layer 2-3 of V2, and then V1 is the region that's lower in the hierarchy. And with the retrograde labeling, you can see that those would get input from layer 6 and further, like upper layer 2-3 and layer 1 of V2. And then just as like an illustrative example of this feedback connection, the purple connection, here's just one example drawing of a neuron that, in this case, it's just showing the receiving region where you have the axon coming in down here from the white matter. There's a little branch shooting up in the deeper layer, but fairly local. The axon keeps ascending up all the way to layer 1 and then spreads pretty far up here. All right, so these are the classical hierarchical connections that everyone learns about in the textbooks. Then we have non-hierarchical connections, and basically there are kind of 2 points to make here. One is a lot of cortical columns, even at higher regions in the cortex receive sensorimotor input, sensorimotor input. So also in B2, you can get direct sensory input. Secondly, what's shown here is that we can have these kind of lateral long-range connections that connect columns within a modality or between different modalities. And so if it happens within a modality, it often is observed that the connections are between neurons in the same layer. So you can have connections from layer 3 neurons in this column to layer 3 neurons in this column. Same for layer 5B neurons and layer 6 cortico-cortical connections. And this can happen either within a region, so like different columns within V1 connecting laterally to each other, or going through the corpus callosum to the other side of the brain and basically connecting left and right hemisphere. And then it can also happen between modalities. So for instance, connections between primary visual cortex and primary auditory or sensory cortex. And there, some papers report connections like this, but predominantly they look a bit more like the feedback connections I just showed. So in the sense that they originate from the deeper layers and then have some more local connectivity in the deeper layers of the receiving column and ascend up to layer 1 and have a broader spread there. And just again to show a couple of visualizations, here's the kind of local spread across columns within a region in layer 2, 3, and layer 5. Here you can see an example of the layer 6 cortico-cortical cells. So here we have pyramidal cells in layer 6 that connect to other cells, mostly in layer 6, but in different columns. And then here's an example of connections that go through the corpus callosum, where they essentially injected a dye over here, and then what this graph shows is like all of the red dots or red neurons are where they then visualize these neurons after injecting the dye over here. So you can see that you can find a lot of these projections in layer 2, 3, in mouse, macaque, and human monkey, mouse, macaque, and human. And then a couple of them in layer 5 and in layer 6. But notably none in layer 4. Oh yeah, just to clarify, these are non-hierarchical connections because they can both connect like first-order regions between different modalities, which wouldn't be thought of as hierarchical connections. They can also connect columns within a modality and even connect columns between hemispheres of the brain, so very long range. And then secondly, these input connections going to also higher order regions again indicate that even higher regions and lower regions can respond in parallel to sensory input. And it doesn't necessarily, the information doesn't necessarily need to propagate from region 1 to region 2 to region 3, but instead region 3 can get direct sensory input and directly do inference based on that.
Yeah, maybe just kind of consistent with what you were just saying, but emphasizing that, yeah, and they can be symmetric for those reasons. So like go in both directions, basically between regions, which contrasts them to the kind of the defining element of the hierarchical connections, which was that asymmetry that was originally observed.
Right, yeah, that's a good point. Okay, so next, the Cortico-Thalamic connections. So there are several. I'm first going to show this one. While the cortex is receiving input, always routed through the thalamus, the cortex is also sending back some information to the thalamus. And that information comes from layer 6B, and it's usually characterized as only modulatory, so it doesn't really cause these cells to fire on its own, but it can modulate how these cells fire or when they fire. And here is a picture from a nice book from Sherman and Guillory about the thalamus that kind of shows this. So we have input to thalamic relay cells. So this is a first order thalamic nucleus, this higher order thalamic nucleus. So the input goes onto that relay cell. That is a driving input. It causes the cell to fire and provide input to layer 4 of the first cortical area, the input layer, if you remember. And then we can have cells here in layer 6 that project back down here to the thalamus. And this is drawn a little bit lighter because this is the modulatory connection. So it doesn't itself cause the cell to fire, but modulates its activity. And then what I'm going to show next on the next slide is there, but I'll just show it here because it's already shown. There are also cells in layer 5 which connect down to the thalamic nucleus with driving input, and this is information that also gets sent down to the motor centers in lower parts of the brain. And so that's kind of, you can think of it as an efference copy of a motor command. And this is actual driving input to the cell versus the modulatory input here from layer 6B. And then the interesting thing is that the layer 6B cells can send this input both down to the thalamic nucleus where they receive their input from, but also up to the next higher order thalamic nucleus that then sends input to the next higher region. So unless you're at the first order nucleus, most thalamic nuclei actually receive converging input from two hierarchically arranged regions. And that's kind of illustrated here as well, where we have these nicely topographically arranged neurons in cortex, again, mapping next to each other from two different regions onto points in the thalamus. And yeah, this kind of converging input onto thalamic nucleus will be important for the compositional object modeling that I'll talk about later. So what do these connections mean in a hierarchy? You can argue that they do support a hierarchical interpretation because it does kind of map down to the input region and the next higher up in the hierarchy. But it's also, yeah, kind of an output that's sent from every region in the neocortex down back to the thalamus. So it's not like, yeah, it's kind of a parallel process that happens everywhere in the neocortex. And then lastly, one other connection to the thalamus and also to lower regions of the brain are the motor outputs. So layer 5A sends out an axon down to subcortical regions that control, for example, the muscles of your eye or muscles in your body or down to the brainstem. But these axons kind of bifurcate and send a branch of them to the higher order nucleus of the thalamus, which then inputs to the next region. That's what I showed in the earlier picture. But here's a nice anatomical drawing of this happening. So basically you have these axons that then split in two at these points that are marked with red arrows. And one part goes to the spine, and another part goes up to the brain, to neocortex. And so, yeah, you can think of it as an efference copy, like a copy of the motor command that gets then sent up to the next layer of the cortical hierarchy. So again, this can be thought of as hierarchical in a way, since it goes from one region to next higher up region, but also non-hierarchical because basically every region of the brain has a motor output. Every region of the brain outputs something down to motor-related structures, which is not a way that people often think about information processing in the cortex. Usually people think about visual information entering, going to V1, V2, V4, getting processed more and more, and then eventually recognizing an object and a scene, and then eventually the motor cortex, a separate part of the neocortex, is thinking about what to do and then sending motor commands down to the limbs. But that's really an incomplete picture. Actually, even V1 can send commands to inform how to move the eyes, for example. So anywhere in the brain, we have outputs from layer 5 down to subcortical areas. Did I miss something else?
No, and yeah, sounds great. And I really like all the figures you added. I think it's nice grounding of the paper.
Yeah, it was kind of fun to dig back in and finding these. Okay, cool. So kind of the conclusion or the argument we make based on this is that hierarchy is really a bit of a limiting term to use when describing the functional organization of the neocortex. It's really more of a heterarchy in the sense that there are hierarchical connections and there is hierarchical processing happening, but there are also a lot of non-hierarchical connections and a lot of parallel processing happening. We have these lateral connections between regions. We have motor output from every region in the brain. We have feedback and feed-forward connections to different thalamic nuclei, and we have direct sensory input to higher regions. So that really suggests a much more complex picture than how people often think about processing in the brain, and also what deep learning systems suggest that are often compared to the brain. All right, so that's the first part of the presentation, the neuroscience part. Anyone have some questions on that? Okay, so now the second part is the theory part. So while there is lots of anatomical and physiological evidence for these kind of long-range connections, there isn't really a comprehensive theory to make sense of all of these connections. And what we're suggesting here is that if you think of the brain as a sensorimotor learning system, there is a unique and very crucial role for each of these long-range connections. And to explain those roles, I'll start with some background. Some of this has already been published before as the Thousand Brains theory. Some of it is new. But this is briefly focused on just one column, so not long-range connections, to give a bit of a foundation. So basically, the sensor sends feature information and movement information to the thalamus, and the thalamus then relays this information to the neocortex, to the cortical column. The proposal is that feature information gets sent up to layer 4, the classical input layer, and then the second kind of location of input to neocortex is this border of layer 5 and layer 6. And the theory suggests that layer 4 represents features, and then in layer 6 we are keeping track of location and orientation. And there are strong associative connections between layer 4 and layer 6. And those can be used to learn associations between features and locations. So we can learn which features exist at what relative locations, and the movement input can be used to update the internal location representation inside the cortical column. Through a series of movements, we'll activate a bunch of different feature representations and a bunch of different location representations. And those change all the time as we're moving over an object. But then they get pooled into kind of an object representation, which I call here the object ID. And that remains constant. So as I'm moving my finger over a coffee mug, for example, the features and locations I'm sensing at any point in time are changing as I move over that object. But the object ID would remain constant and stable. And this is what would be the output of layer 3, and that's what would become the input to layer 4 in the next higher region. One thing that is new in this picture is this backward projection from layer 6b to the thalamus, which we propose here is used to inform the thalamus of an orientation transform that it needs to apply to both the features and the locations. And this is new, and I'll talk about that in a bit more detail in a moment. But essentially, the idea is that information from the sensor is in an egocentric format. So how am I moving my finger relative to my body, for example? But then representations within the column, so locations here, are in an object-centric reference frame. So features on the coffee mug are all like locations and features relative to each other in a reference frame that's just for this coffee mug. And having the separation allows us to really generalize. I can learn about a coffee mug in one room, in one location and orientation, and then I can recognize that same coffee mug in any other location, in any other orientation, because the thalamus can transform any movement that's happening in the egocentric format, so relative to the body. It can take that, take the orientation hypothesis from the column and use it to transform the movement and features into the object-centric reference frame. And that's a really powerful idea for being able to recognize objects in any location and orientation, even though they were learned in one particular location and orientation. Okay, that's kind of the foundation. Any questions on that? Okay. I'll cover this one briefly because this was actually already suggested in previous papers from Numenta and the Thousand Brains theory. So the proposed role for the lateral connections, so these connections that are between the same layer of two cortical columns, those can be used to reach rapid consensus. So that's something that we're already using in the current Monty implementation, something we call voting, where each cortical column is receiving input from different patches and sensory patches in the world. So the eye, one part of the eye might be looking at the rim of the cup, another part of the eye might be looking at the body of the cup, and then you might be touching the handle of the cup with your finger. So each sensor gets different kind of input, and each column has learned potentially different models of objects. For instance, the model learned by the column connected to the finger wouldn't contain color information. But whenever they are all sensing the same object, they all have a particular object representation active in layer 3, and that is a pretty constant representation as long as the sensors are on that object. And so the lateral connections can be used to quickly reach consensus. So even though each column by itself might not know for sure yet what it is sensing, this patch that's here on the body of the cup might think it's a cup or a cylinder. It's not sure about that. The one that's on the rim might think it's a cup or a bowl. And the one on the handle might think it's a cup or scissors. By communicating with each other, they can quickly narrow down what's possible combining each of their hypotheses. And what's not really shown here, but important to note, is that this would also take into account the relative location of the sensors and the hypothesized orientation of the objects. And yeah, for a description of the implementation of this algorithm, you can see our paper that demonstrates Monty's capabilities that Niels just presented. Okay, so now to the first big new proposal in this paper, which is the role of the thalamus in transforming sensory and motor information from an egocentric format into an object-centric format. So whenever information enters thalamus, it will be in an egocentric format. It will be relative to the body or some structure on the body, like to the head or something like that. And that's indicated by these dashed lines. All the information that enters the column will be relative to an object, the object that's currently represented by that column. And in order to do this, we need to inform the thalamus of how to rotate the incoming information to go from egocentric to object-centric format. And the proposal is that this is done by the layer 6B projections to the thalamus. The idea is that layer 6B represents the orientation of the sensor to the object represented in this column. And this orientation is sent down here and then used to rotate both the incoming movement information and the orientation of the features. There's another transform that needs to be happening, which is the motor output. The motor output needs to be in egocentric coordinates, since it doesn't pass through any thalamic nuclei anymore, but directly goes down to the actuators. And so there's connectivity from layer 6B to layer 5A. And our proposal is that the transform would be happening there. There's some more detail on why we think that is possible in the paper too. And so this really makes sense in the idea that the projection from layer 6B is only modulatory, and the input is a driving input because we have the incoming feature and movement as the driving input, but then this connection can modulate how this is passed forward to the neocortex. And essentially the thalamus would be acting as a multiplexer, mapping one orientation to another orientation, depending on which input it receives from layer 6B. Does that make sense? Okay. Yeah, it's probably all pretty familiar to all of you right now because we talked about this so much already. Another thing that's shown in this figure is the different types of movement input that can be used by the neocortex to move us through the reference frame of the object. And so we can get movement information either from the retina itself, like optic flow. For example, you can watch someone play a video game and without controlling anything, you know how this person is moving through the virtual world just based on how the patterns are moving on your retina. You can get efference copies of the actual motor commands. So like outputs from the superior colliculus or the vestibular system about how your sensors are actually moving. And then also this efference copy of the motor command that's being sent to the next higher region. Okay, so now the second big proposal of this paper is the interpretation of hierarchy. So while there are many non-hierarchical connections, there are also these hierarchical connections. both the feed-forward and the feedback connections. But like I mentioned, how those are often thought of is this kind of hierarchical processing from the sensor to the thalamus, and then processing increasingly more complex features. So first edges, and then some more complex features, and then eventually some representation of objects. And these are some images of representations in neural networks, which are often kind of compared to the cortical processing lately. But how we propose hierarchy is used is to model compositional objects. And when I say compositional objects, I don't mean just complex features being combined from edges and objects being combined out of complex features, but actual 3D objects that are made of other 3D objects. So if you remember the first slide, while each column only gets a small patch of input at any one point in time, as it moves over objects, the representation of the object is constant, and it can therefore model and recognize entire objects that are much bigger than the receptive field that it gets as input at any one point in time. And so even columns in V1 or V2 can represent entire objects that are larger than their receptive field by moving in the world. And so here's one example of how compositional structure could be represented. So for instance, as we're attending to different features on this dog, region 2 has learned a model of a dog. Region 1 has learned a model of a dog's tail. So at a certain location in the model of the dog, the tail exists. And then at another location on the dog, the head exists. But then both region 1 and region 2 can have a model of the head of the dog. And through shifting our attention, region 2 can then attend to the dog's head, while region 1 represents the eye, which is again at a particular location on the head. It's not just features that are somehow coexisting, it's features structured in reference frames. So the relative arrangement of these features is really important as well. And this kind of compositional structure is both encoded in the feed-forward and in the feedback connections. So I'll show how exactly we propose that in a moment. One last thing to emphasize again here is that all the regions are receiving sensory and motor input. There's not just the processing of features that are static. Our sensors are moving all the time, and both features and movement are integrated in the same region. So while it might sound like a small twist to say hierarchical connections model compositional objects, it is actually quite a different conceptual way of thinking of hierarchy. Maybe just one last thing to point out is that pretty much all compositional structure can be represented by very few regions, by just shifting your attention between different parts of an object. Like, you don't need hundreds of layers to process things. You can just attend to one feature and then decompose it into sub-features. You would normally not attend to more than 2 levels in a hierarchy. You can kind of think about that yourself. Like, as you're looking at the dog, you wouldn't really at the same time decompose it into head and eyes without shifting your attention between them. And so models of the same objects can exist at in different levels of the hierarchy at the same time, and you can kind of shift your attention between them. Did I miss something else?
No, I guess I was just thinking, yeah, maybe we don't comment on this that much in the paper, but it also fits well with the purpose of the top-down connection, because the higher level object is telling the low level object where it should be. So there's like a very clear kind of proposal about that. one of the issues with kind of deep learning as a model of the brain is it often doesn't have a clear explanation for this top-down connection, because if that top-down connection is doing some kind of computation, then that creates a cyclic graph, which tends to break backpropagation. But then it doesn't work as being the means of backpropagation, because it involves kind of biologically impossible assumptions like symmetric connections, or it just works very poorly compared to the backprop that actually powers deep learning systems. So yeah, I guess as part of this kind of hierarchy composition, it gives a clear kind of reason for that very well-defined L6 to L6 connection with then the broader kind of output in L1.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's a good point. Okay, so now how does this actually get implemented in a cortical column? First of all, just getting into a bit more of the complexities of modeling compositional objects. You might first think, okay, it's simple. I have a model of a cup and I have a model of a logo, and now I want to learn the logo on the cup. And when I learn this cup with the logo on it, I don't have to relearn a model of the logo. I don't have to relearn a model of the cup. I can simply assign the logo to the existing location, the existing model of the logo to a location of the existing model of a cup. Super efficient process. That's the promise of learning compositional objects. You can combine things very quickly. You don't have to relearn a bunch of stuff you already have learned before. You can assign the logo to the mark here, and then that's it. Small tweak on it. Logo might be in a different orientation on the mug. Okay, so we associate a location on the mug with a particular location and orientation of the logo. So the kind of connection between the two needs to include not just the object IDs and relative locations, but also the relative orientation. Now it gets a little more complicated. The logo might be changing in scale as we go along the surface of the cup, or part of the logo might be shown in a different location and orientation. So for one, we need to include scale. Not that big of a deal, but here scale is different in different locations on the mug, and here orientation is different on different locations on the mug. So what we kind of settled on is that this association needs to happen on many locations on the mug. So on a location by location basis, each location on the mug needs to be associated with the location and orientation and scale of the logo. And that happens at many different points here. And this also kind of helps learn how this logo that was initially learned in 2D can now actually wrap around this 3D mug. And lastly, there's no kind of pre-assumption of which object will be the child object and what will be the parent object. It's not like the logo will always be on the mug. The mug might actually be part of the logo, where the logo is the parent object and the mug is a child feature on that object. So there are all these kind of combinations, and initially they seem kind of difficult to figure out, but the solution we came up with is that they get associated on a location by location basis, including object ID, location and orientation and scale of the child object relative to the parent. So how would this look like in a cortical column using these long-range connections? So here's an example where we have a series of fixations on this cup with the logo on it. And depending on where we are fixating, the two regions in the cortex are representing different objects. Note that both of these regions are receiving sensory input. The lower region, like V1, receives a smaller receptive field. The higher region receives input from a larger receptive field. and from the lower region output from layer 3. So at fixation 1, both regions would be representing the cup. Fixation 2, both regions are representing the cup. Fixation 3, the lower region would represent the logo, the higher region would represent the cup. Together they would learn the logo on the cup. Same for fixation 4 and 5, whereas at fixation 5, the orientation of the logo would be different. Both of these receptive fields are co-located, so they're both both the input to region 1 and region 2 comes from the same location in space. It's just a larger receptive field. So now, bear with me, it's a bit much to take in at first. As we already showed on the kind of first slide, layer 3 is a representation of the object that's learned in region 1. So layer 3 would be encoding the ID of the logo, and layer 3 connects to layer 4 of the next higher region. So basically the object ID becomes a feature in the model at the next higher region. So TBP logo now becomes an input to this feature layer, layer 4 of region 2, and gets associated with locations on the compositional object. Note that this input doesn't encode like the whole model. It doesn't encode the structural composition of the logo. It's just an ID of that object. So this connection alone kind of explains how we learn at which locations on the mug the logo exists. Basically, whenever we're on the logo on the cup, the logo will be represented in layer 3 here and sent to layer 4 of region 2. And region 2 will associate that logo ID with locations on the mug through those layer 4, layer 6 associative connections. Now, region 2, after having learned the logo on the cup, also wants to inform region 1 when it should be expecting the logo. So if we're like on fixation 3 and region 2 knows the TBP mug model, we move to fixation 4, region 2 should be able to tell region 1 to expect to see the logo and where on the logo it should expect to be. So that's what the feedback connection is for. We have both this very local connectivity to the deeper regions, which would communicate a unique location on the logos model. So remember, layer 6A encodes the locations in object-centric reference frame. So basically, region 2 would tell region 1, expect to be at this location on the logo. And then we have this broader connectivity in layer 1, which kind of more broadly inform also neighboring columns about the existence of the logo, but not really quite precisely about the location on it. And then finally, we also need to know the orientation of the logo relative to the cup. And that's what these orange connections are for, or yellow. So region 1, like arrow marked with E, represent the orientation of the sensor to the logo. Region 2, layer 6B, represents the orientation of the sensor to the cup. If we combine these two orientations, we get the orientation of the logo relative to the cup at the current location. And that's also the input to layer 4 of region 2, and can get associated with a specific location on the cup model. So that's pretty crucial. We get the relative orientation of the logo to the cup because it's the relative orientation and not just the absolute orientation of the logo. It needs to be a relative orientation, because imagine learning the logo on the mug, the TBP mug model, and now you're tilting the TBP mug. The orientation of the logo is changing, and the orientation of the mug is changing, but the relative orientation of the logo to the mug is unchanged. So the input here is still exactly the same. And there's no need to update the model or anything. We just need to represent the relative orientation between the logo and the mug. So we can recognize it in any kind of, we can recognize the compositional model in any orientation in the world.
One question here. Sorry. Are the projections between layer 6A of region 1 and 2, are these bidirectional or just feedback from region 2 to region 1?
That's just feedback. So the location in the feed-forward connection is you get that. This is not shown in here, but the input from the thalamus also includes the movement information to the border of layer 5 and layer 6. And that movement information moves you through the reference frame of the mug up here as the sensor is moving. So that location in the mug's reference frame then gets associated with the logo object ID through those kind of internal associative connections.
I'm just wondering, so it makes this association with the object ID, but it doesn't know where on the object it's making this association. Like, for example, with the number 5 on the cup, it doesn't know that this is the word project that is being, like this part of the logo is being assigned here. It just knows that, okay, I know that the logo is being assigned here. So when it goes back from region 2 to region 1, how does it tell it this is the location it should be on?
Yeah, so that's what basically region 1 learns when it connects here to the feedback connection. So region 2 has learned the model of the cup. So if we're at location 5 in the mug's reference frame, we send this location representation down to region 1, and region 1 associates that with a specific location on its logo model, so on the J of the word project. And so that's a very an association between a specific location on the mug to a specific location on the logo. It's not bidirectional. So you're right that region 2 does not know where on the logo exactly it is. But it also doesn't need to know because region 2 doesn't have a full model of the Thousand Brains logo. It only gets the object ID. It's kind of a more simplified version.
Okay, that makes sense.
Makes sense? Okay, so there's, I don't know if you noticed, but we're not communicating the expected orientation from region 2 to region 1 right now in this diagram. One proposal we have for that is that this can get communicated by the layer 6 cortico-cortical connections, but we're not certain enough in that to have included it in this paper. There's also no showing of how scale gets processed, but the idea is essentially that it's a similar mechanism to orientation in that we calculate a relative scale and associate that relative scale with a location on the compositional object. Yeah, does someone have some more questions?
Yeah, I have one kind of question. So if we go back to the first part of this slide where we're talking about the fixations 1, 2, 3. No, on the slide we're on, yeah. And fixation 1, everyone's seeing a cup. In fixation 2, everyone's seeing a cup. In fixation 3, R1 is seeing a logo. But isn't the patch that R2 is getting, it's also mostly a logo. So how does it stay with the idea that it's looking at a cup and not decide, oh, I'm looking at a new object now, because all it's seeing is that patch?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I think a kind of a practical question we have with Monty right now as well. So we have not really tested a concrete mechanism for that yet. I guess one thing is that this region is receiving a larger, lower resolution version of the input, so it would likely not really see any of the specific features, be able to perceive specific features of the logo. So it might take a bit more for it to switch its hypothesis. But yeah, there isn't really that principle of a mechanism for learning it. For inference, it's simple because region 2 would be representing the compositional object itself. I don't know, Niels, if you had some more thoughts on it.
No, yeah, I think like you said, it's probably to do with like the sensory input that and kind of also its sensitivity or kind of related to that, like just its sensitivity to spatial detail, that it's not going to kind of as quickly pick up on things like that. But yeah, it's a good question, and like Viviane says, a thing we need to practically get working.
It might, well, actually, region 2 might from the beginning just represent TBP cup once it sees that the logo is there, which is not in its default model of the cup. So it might just start saying, okay, this is a new object I don't know really anything about. So it would just set the ID to TBP cup, the specific cup, and then learn that at this location, the logo exists. And after learning, kind of, this is a compositional object of logo and cup. Any other questions? Okay, so yeah, just to kind of summarize, many connections in the neocortex are not strictly hierarchical. All the long-range connections serve a crucial role when viewing each cortical column as a sensory motor processing unit, where each column can learn complete models of objects. Each column receives sensory and motor input, and each column also outputs sensory and motor signals. And columns can work in parallel and hierarchically because of that. The proposal for the function that these connections serve is that the hierarchical connections are used to learn compositional objects, so objects composed of other objects. Lateral connections are used to establish rapid consensus between the hypotheses in different columns. And the Cortico-Thalamic connections are used to inform reference frame transforms applied in the thalamus to the incoming features and movements. And then what's kind of the significance of this paper? So this theory that we propose in the papers provides a comprehensive explanation for the long-range connections in the neocortex, or a lot of them. It explains physiological and anatomical findings that previously had no explanation. It's testable, and it suggests the functional role for the thalamus as kind of a pose converter, which is central to all cortical computations in a sensory motor system. You can't really have a sensory motor system without having something that does this, which we noticed as we built Monty. And it suggests an alternate way of building artificial intelligence, one we have implemented over the past years, and Niels just showed the significant advantages of such a system that works on these principles. Yeah. It's the Heterarchy paper.